George Beccaloni joins me today at the campfire. George is an evolutionary biologist and a historian of science. He has worked at London's Natural History Museum for more than 20 years, publishing articles on butterflies, cockroaches, and other insects. As a science historian, he has studied the life and legacy of Alfred Russel Wallace and is the founder and director of the Wallace Correspondence Project. In that role, he has contributed to many articles and books on Wallace. And through the Wallace Memorial Fund, George has helped restore the great man's grave, as well as erect a statue of Wallace, complete with his butterfly net, at the London Natural History Museum. He has achieved many other feats and accolades, but to me, George, the coolest thing is that you have one very particular title and function. You have to be a very rare breed indeed, if in this day and age, you can call yourself a ship's naturalist. George, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Harry. Nice to see you again. We met about 5 years for the first time on Bunaken Island off the north coast of Sulawesi Island.
I think so. And I think I was trying to lecture you on Wallace at the time.
Yeah, it was a very nice island with a beautiful coral reef, but totally infested with giant Scolopendra centipedes, as I remember.
Yes.
And there was that Austrian guy who's really big and tough, and he was walking back at night to his room and with sandals on, and he stepped on one of these huge centipedes, and it wrapped around his foot and bit him. So he rushed off to his room and lay on his bed, put his hand under his pillow, and then was bitten by another. And I just heard him sort of screaming for ages and ages from his room.
I remember that, just crying all through the night. It must have been such a terrible pain.
Yep. Yeah, I've always disliked those giant centipedes, but I have one centipede claim to fame, which I'll mention
yes, please.
Later on in this podcast.
No, I like centipedes. The bite is not not very nice.
But at least only about one person's ever been recorded as dying from a Scolopendra bite.
Okay, that's very low. I didn't know. Huh.
Just extremely painful.
Yeah. And you were just traveling throughout Indonesia when we met, and you're doing a lot of traveling still as I said, a ship's naturalist. But it's your love for nature and natural history, I think, started a long time ago, as for most of us. You started as a child, right? It's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they say that naturalists aren't born. Sorry, they are born. Sorry, they say that naturalists are born, not made. And that was certainly the case with me. All my earliest memories from Kenya, where I was born, are all natural history related.
Wow.
And my first sort of encounters with natural history subjects I don't remember because I was about one. So, for instance, my mother tells a story of how she came out into the garden and found me clutching this black disc. And I was saying, cookie, cookie, and I'd bitten into it. And it was one of these giant millipedes that had coiled up.
Yeah.
And it squirted all these horrible hydrophenols, or whatever they are.
Yes, they're very
She said
toxic.
she couldn't get the smell off me for about 2 weeks. And another time in that same garden, I was almost killed by African giant bees. My grandmother was looking after me, and she was in the house. And then she heard the sound of a swarm of African bees approaching. So she rushed out in the garden, grabbed me by my nappy, and took me inside. And the bees came into the garden and the adjacent garden and stung a puppy to death in the next garden.
Oh, wow.
So I was really lucky that she, got me in time.
And those African bees are the ancestors of the so-called killer bees, right?
The killer bees, I think, are hybrids. Yeah.
Yeah. Huh.
But all my earliest memories, as I say, from Kenya are natural history related, like finding hedgehogs in the garden. And one of my earliest memories was dragging around a large fish when I was aged 2 years old. which my father, I think, had caught. And I really wanted it. So they gave it to me. And apparently, yeah, I spent all day dragging this fish around and then was very surprised when it became totally bloated and full of gas and smelled really terrible by the end of the day.
In the hot African sun, I can imagine that.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I left Zimbabwe when I was about 5, and then sorry, I left Kenya when I was about 5, and
Right.
then grew up in Zimbabwe and left there when I was about 14.
Mm.
And when I was in Zimbabwe, I was also obviously very interested in natural history, mainly reptiles early on, and I read Gerald Durrell's My Family and Other Animals, and
Oh,
that really
yes.
inspired me. And
Wonderful book. Yes.
yeah, excellent. And I got my my mother's boyfriend to make me a collecting box like Gerald Durrell had,
Mm.
and things in which I used to carry around. And all the snakes I came across, if they looked harmless, I assumed that they were harmless, and I would collect them.
Oof.
But I had some sort of close calls. There was one nice snake, sort of with lines, that I found in the rockery in our garden, and I was, I used to handle it, and I kept it in a bucket of soil by my bed with a sheet of glass on it. And but very soon after I got it, it escaped into my bedroom, and I never saw it again. And then when I went back to boarding school, I looked it up,
Yeah.
and it had looked harmless, but it was actually called something like in Afrikaans a skarpstrekker, and it said that basically it was probably poisonous and
Oh.
venomous.
So that's close call number 3 with a venomous animal growing up in Africa.
Yeah, another occasion, I was walking under these eucalyptus trees, and this long brown snake fell on the ground. So I
Mm.
happened to have my sort of forked snake stick with me, and I got it, put it in a cloth bag, and then went to a friend's house and asked his mother to drive me to the local museum.
Okay.
And then halfway there, I noticed the bag was empty. So I said, "Oh, my snake's escaped." And she almost crashed the car. She veered off the road, jumped out, and I found it sort of coiled up under his seat.
Oh, that's
Uh,
awesome. Yes, the
Another,
parents of reptile enthusiasts are long suffering, I think. Mine were too.
one other snake story was, well, it involved a really rare chameleon that I found, Rampolian marshalli,
Oh.
which is one of these dwarf chameleons,
Hmm.
founded in the Vumba Mountains in the border of Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And
Very
I
hard to
took,
find, I imagine. It looked just
yeah,
like a dead leaf. Yeah.
yeah, really amazing. And I took it to the local museum in what's now Mutare, and I used to take them all the snakes that I found, and they used to sometimes exhibit them. But in this case, because it was so special, I was ushered down to see the reptile expert.
Mm.
And I went into his room, and he was on the phone and talking away, and I was just looking at the things on his desk, and I saw a jar of liquid with
Hmm.
this object, and I thought, oh, is that a snake or something, or part of a snake? And he put down the phone and said, "Oh, you're looking at that as my finger." And it turns out that he had been out in the bush on a collecting expedition, and something very venomous had bitten him, like a
Mm.
slung or something. So he immediately got his bush knife and cut off his own finger,
Oof.
and then was so pleased that he preserved it in formaldehyde or whatever as a desk ornament.
Yeah, that is a hardcore herpetologist right there. Yeah. Well, I've seen what happens with you see sometimes photographs of what happens when you actually let the venom do its work. It seems better to chop it off sometimes. Yeah.
Yep, unless it was a dry bite, then he
Yeah.
chopped it off for nothing.
Yeah. Could have been.
But
Wow.
yeah, so Zimbabwe, I developed my interest in butterflies aged
Mm.
about 10, because a friend of mine was interested in catching butterflies, and that became my main kind of focus. And I dreamt of actually doing it for a career, which, of course, if I'd stayed in Africa, would have been impossible. And it's virtually impossible anywhere actually in the world. There's not that many
Yeah. Anytime after the
professional.
19th century, that became an extinct profession, I think.
Exactly. But so yeah, I'm just planning to tell you a few sort of funny stories, natural history stories that have happened, to me
Hmm.
uh, during my life. So it's sort of a bit chronological, because that seems more logical to do it that way.
Definitely.
So when I was 14, I left Zimbabwe,
Uh-huh.
and my parents came to England, and applied for a work visa for the United States. I was sent to my aunt
Hmm.
in Boulder, Colorado, and I spent a year and a half there.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was a bit of a shock to the system. I saw things like snow for the first time, and
Yeah.
modern things like computers, and I remember my first encounter with a microwave. I'd never even heard of a microwave, and I went to a friend of the family's house, and they told me about this marvelous microwave. Um, and I was really interested in it. They left the house to go to the shops or something.
Hmm.
So I experimented by putting their cactus into it and sort of blasting it for 10 seconds to see what happened. And it actually had no visible effect. I was a bit disappointed, but I thought I'd better not risk doing it anymore.
No.
So I took them out, the cactus out and put it there, and it looked fine. But then several days later, my aunt said to me, "Oh, you didn't microwave my friend's cactus, by the way." And she
Wow.
said that it suddenly sort of went liquid. Um, but to this day, I don't know how they worked out that it was me who microwaved it, because it
Yes, I was
wasn't
amazed when
visible.
you said it. That was very clever.
Yeah,
Well, you must have expressed enough interest in the microwave yeah, to make it.
raised suspicions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then
Wow.
after that, I came. My parents didn't get their visas for the States, so I came over to England, and that's where
Mm.
I've been ever since. And went to university here, and then did a PhD at London's Natural History Museum.
Yes.
A joint PhD with Imperial College, University of London,
Hmm.
and the Natural History Museum, and it was on the aspects of the evolution and ecology of a group of butterflies from South and Central America and the
Hmm.
Caribbean called the Ethomyaini. And I was
Okay.
looking at mimicry, how uh, sort of mimicry evolved in this group, because they're famous for their mimicry. They
Yes.
um, are aposematically colored, so brightly colored or distinctively colored, so that predators can remember them. But mimicry theory, well, there's two basic sorts of mimicry in butterflies. There's actually more, but the two common ones are Batesian mimicry, where a tasty species has evolved to mimic toxic or unpalatable species,
Hmm.
and so is avoided by predators who think that that's
That's what
toxic
most
species.
people think of when they think about mimicry. Yeah.
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 The other sort of counterintuitive type of mimicry is called Mullerian, after Fritz Muller, the famous German naturalist who lived in Brazil. And it's where toxic or unpalatable species have evolved to mimic each other.
Hmm.
They've converged on a common color pattern, because it reduces the number of different patterns that birds have to memorize to learn to avoid. Um, and so it decreases the mortality of the group.
Yeah.
So if there were 10 species, each with a different pattern, and a naive bird that had just fledged, would have to sample each one, remember 10 patterns. But if they all
Yeah.
share one pattern, then there's, a massive decrease in predation, because only one from the group would have to be taken. And that's the case with the ethonians. They're
Okay.
protected by these toxic pyrrolizidine alkaloids,
Yeah.
which they mainly get as adults. And birds, if they taste them, release them. And the butterflies are very tough
Hmm.
bodies. So they often survive being caught. Um,
And did
and
you
I
study them
was,
yourself in the field or
yeah,
mm,
so I was studying the pheromones of them, in case, well, to find out whether the species could tell each other apart from the pheromone bouquets, which is what you would expect because they all look the same. I also looked to see if they had hidden ultraviolet color patterns that the butterflies could see, but other things couldn't see. But of course, birds can see UV light, so
Yes.
that wouldn't work. So they rely on complicated pheromone bouquets to distinguish, members of their own species.
Right.
But I was also looking at the question of why there are often many different color patterns of the same group of butterflies in one habitat, whereas mimicry theory would say that they should all converge onto one best protected pattern.
Yeah.
And it was suspected that it might be because they occupied different strata in the forest, but it hadn't really been studied. So I studied that and found indeed that there were ones that color patterns that flew near the ground, ones in the canopy, and also in different microhabitats like secondary forest, primary forest. There were different dominant patterns, and I worked out that it was probably due to where the host plants grew, and also the height of the host plants that were utilized. So species that flew high up tended to utilize shrubs or trees or epiphytes of the groups of plants that they fed on.
Yeah.
So Solanaceae, basically, potato family.
Yes.
And the color patterns that flew low down utilized herbaceous plants. And because there's sort of different guilds of birds in different microhabitats and strata, there's different
Right.
predators, and the butterflies that all had a similar flight height and microhabitat seem to have converged
Huh.
together.
That's
But
amazing.
there hasn't been convergence between the strata, etc.
It's hard to imagine that a rainforest is really built up of these layers that don't interact that much, apparently,
Yeah.
at least for some organisms. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Wow.
yeah, that was interesting. I did 3 field trips to Ecuador,
Oh,
studying these butterflies, and yeah,
nice.
that was an enjoyable part of my life.
Yeah.
But actually, the first time I did an expedition to the tropics was when I was still an undergraduate at Imperial College, and
Okay.
I organized for a group of 3 of us to go to Papua New Guinea to do various studies. So a friend of mine was going to study the mushrooms used by local people. I was looking for a particular interesting cockroaches, which is believed to suckle its young.
Oh,
And we were all going to do a survey of the insects and other invertebrates eaten by local people. But anyway, so we got to New Guinea, went off into the highlands, and started our projects.
well, I mean, New Guinea is not beginner's tropics. It's a pretty tough
No,
place,
uh,
I would say. And you
well,
were
this
there
was
as
in,
young as well, relatively young biologists.
yeah, well, this was in 1990 when
Mm.
very, very few tourists were going to New Guinea at that time. I think actually very few go these days because it's so dangerous, but we didn't
Still.
realize how dangerous it was. Although I remember when we got off the plane and got into Port Moresby, I saw all these red stains all over the place. I thought, God, this place really is dangerous. There's been multiple stabbings, but it was actually beetle nut juice that people spat onto the pavement.
Right.
But we were pretty naive at the time, and it ended up not being stupid, but it could have been fatal. Thing that we did was all our clothing was army surplus clothing because we thought
Right.
it was hard wearing and cheap and everything. But in most countries or many countries, you don't want to be wearing that sort of clothing because they think you're, from the army.
Yes.
But it turned out to be a positive advantage in New Guinea, and we didn't realize it for a long time. When we were walking around in the highlands, people were abnormally friendly, and they'd come up and slap our backs and shake our hands and say
Oh.
thank you. And we thought, God, these people are really nice. And we only found out later, towards the end of the trip, someone said, actually, you know why the people are so friendly? They think that you're Australian troops who got rid of all the Japanese troops in
Oh,
World War II. So,
wow. Well,
yeah, New Guinea was an eye-opening experience. The survey of invertebrates eaten by local people failed because we found that they absolutely ate everything from orb web spiders to shield bugs to
really?
cockroaches, just everything. So it was impossible to create a list.
But shield bugs and cockroaches, they have these terrible glands and chemicals that they shouldn't be very palatable.
No, all I can think of is the shield bugs might have tasted a bit like coriander because they smell a bit like
Well,
coriander.
that they do, yeah.
The cockroaches are non-toxic ones. The ones that they told me, I was looking for these amphibious cockroaches, which
Mm.
live under stones by the sides of streams, and I couldn't find any. Um, and I asked the local people, "Do you know these cockroaches?" And they said, "Oh yes, go to that stream there, and
Mhm.
you'll find lots of them." And it turns out that they go there and collect them and steam them in bamboo tubes. Um, But it was
Did
my,
you?
my first introduction to this interesting group of cockroaches found all over the tropics, epilamprines, and
Mhm.
um, they all seem to be amphibious, at least when they're nymphs,
Wow.
so subadults. And but the curious thing is that these small streams that they live on the banks of just have no aquatic plants or anything. They're swift flowing.
Yes.
And the only thing that you could possibly eat in them is algae growing on the rocks. So
Mm.
I observed these cockroaches at night, crawling on the rocks underwater. And I think that's what they must be doing, but it hasn't been proved yet.
Wow. Still, after all these
Yep.
years,
No.
yeah, it's a hard place to get to, I imagine,
Well,
Papua
no,
New Guinea.
I found these cockroaches all over the place in
Mm.
Africa,
Okay.
Madagascar, Southeast Asia. It's
Huh.
just very, very few people study cockroaches.
Yeah, that's the thing. And are they able to breathe underwater because these are very shallow, flat, fast flowing streams, or because they have some sort of plastron or adaptation for breathing underwater, or
But
what is?
they have an adaptation. The rear spiracles are elongated onto tubes, so they
Okay,
can back up on a stone, put the spiracles like snorkels above the water surface, get oxygen,
really?
and go down.
Huh. So they protrude
But I
from
mean,
the body. Wow, that's interesting.
I've seen reports. A guy called Shalford, who was one of the greatest cockroach taxonomists, he said that in the middle of a big river in Borneo, where he was based, he actually saw cockroaches swimming in the middle of the river and diving like diving beetles and coming to the surface.
Oh,
But he wasn't able to catch them. He didn't have a net at the time. But that's
oh,
never been studied. So that
no.
would be,
Wow. Yeah, there's a lot of cockroaches in the world. People only know the few species that live with people and are a nuisance, but there's just so many amazing, beautiful species of cockroaches that don't bother anybody.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the other cockroaches I was interested in New Guinea were these a group in the genus Parisferus, and one of the the leading cockroach expert of all time, Louis Roth, found that on dead specimens of the cockroaches, there was still white young
Oh.
clinging to the underside, and
Hmm.
these nymphs are blind. They have curious proboscis-like sucking mouth parts
Huh.
and huge pulvili on the tarsal pads,
To hold
which
on.
to
Yeah.
hold on. So because they're blind and they're unpigmented, and they seem to be unpigmented for at least two instars, um, it's very, very unlikely that they leave the mother. And the mother happens to have four holes on her ventral surface into which the mouth parts exactly fit.
Wow.
So it's thought that they probably suckle from the mother.
And
And
what would they suckle from those particular holes? Hemolymph or some
no one knows because
gland?
it
Yeah.
hasn't been proved yet.
Huh.
But it seems very likely that it must happen. Anyway, with great difficulty, I managed to find some living examples of these cockroaches, and they're very unusual that the females are wingless and heavily armored, and they roll up into a tight ball when they're attacked by ants or whatever. Um, and anyway, I found them in these vines by beating the vines, and found quite a few of them. And during the 2 months we were in New Guinea, so for about, I don't know, 6 weeks, I kept them alive and was hoping that they would give birth. But
Yes.
none of them did. So I pickled them just before we left New Guinea. When I got back to England, I dissected, the first female I dissected had well-developed young inside her, so would have given birth any day if I
Oh
had.
no.
Yeah, because this group of cockroaches actually gives birth to live young. It's the blabberids. They incubate the egg case internally, and then the young
Yeah.
are produced live.
Yeah. Yes.
But then years later in Thailand, I found actually a female, which I shipped back to the UK, and she gave birth.
Okay.
And I thought, great, I'm now going to resolve this great mystery of, suckling cockroaches. And, I examined her. The nymphs were all clinging to a ventral surface, and put her in a clear glass tube, but I just couldn't see what their heads were doing. So some of them might have been suckling, but it was impossible to tell.
Yes. Yeah.
So these days, actually, that genus is now kept commonly in captivity, but no one's been able to,
Really?
yeah, prove, what they're doing. That you can't observe the nymphs. I thought maybe you're doing, micro CT scan to see where the proboscises of the nymphs were.
That would work, yes. Freeze that,
But
maybe flash freeze them and then scan
yeah,
them. Yeah. Huh. It's
but
funny that it's a species like that, even when in captivity, it still has some secrets that are not resolved. I mean, that's amazing. And how long it takes to figure out, one super interesting biological fact like that is I like that kind of story. And you seem to be very good at it, also with figuring out that cockroaches actually evolved into termites, or at least termites are social cockroaches.
oh yeah, yeah. That
Things
was
like
my
that.
main cockroach claim to fame. It's been thought since the 1930s that termites might be more closely related to cockroaches than people thought. There's certain morphological characteristics of the gut, etc.,
Yeah.
that are almost identical. And the most primitive termite is Master termes from Australia, and it actually produces an egg case,
Ah,
and a sort
just
of
like
a
cockroaches.
crude,
Yes.
yeah, just like cockroaches. But they're so different in so many other ways in ecology, etc., that people have always regarded the cockroaches as a separate order of insects to the termites. But I initiated a study when I was working at the Natural History Museum, where a friend of mine, Paul Eggleton, who is a termite expert, who had a student working on molecular stuff to do with termites. So I said, why don't we, try and solve this problem once and for all? And they agreed. So I got basically samples, tissue samples of a wide cross section of all the families and subfamilies of cockroaches. So that's about 4,600 named species of cockroach, probably about 20,000 in total. So a
Wow.
lot that haven't been named yet. And uh, they got samples of all the termite groups. And then, yeah, we did sort of molecular phylogeny and found that, lo and behold, the termites came out from within the cockroach lineage, and that they were most closely related to a genus of cockroaches, true cockroaches, called Cryptocercis, which is found in the northern hemisphere. And they're
Okay.
interesting because they live inside rotting logs and live in family groups.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
Basically, they need to the young need to live with the parents in order to get the symbionts needed to digest the wood.
Right.
Because every time they molt and grow a bit bigger, the gut lining is shed. Apparently, the stomach lining,
Right.
and all the symbionts go. So they need to be in the same galleries as the parents to get infected again and again with the symbionts to allow them to digest wood. And that's how termites are thought to have evolved.
That that I didn't know. That's super interesting. Oh, it's a good start for sociality and then use sociality after. Yes.
Yep.
Huh.
Yeah, and so since our study, other people, did similar studies to see whether we were right or wrong, and everyone's concluded we were right. So we were able to sync the entire order of Isoptera, although
Mhm.
some termite people still use it, which is completely wrong. You can't have one order Isoptera nested within another order, which is Platodia. So
No.
um,
So what is the new name inside the cockroaches? Do they have, does that clade have a name?
yeah, Termitoideae,
Okay.
an epifamily. We had to erect an epifamily in order to not disturb the classification, the
Well,
higher
good.
classification of the termites and the cockroaches.
That's a good
But
idea.
yeah,
Yes. Conservation of names.
yeah.
Yes.
Just returning to, well, cockroaches and to New Guinea. After New Guinea, I went to
Hmm.
Australia, and I went in search of the world's heaviest cockroach, the giant rhinoceros cockroach, which can weigh up to 40 grams,
Wow.
which is massive for an insect.
Yes.
And I'd heard, because I went to stay on the Atherton Tablelands in Queensland with a family friend, and then I got a coach to this totally remote town called Mount Garnet in the middle of nowhere, because I had read an article that Macropanacea was found there.
Uh-huh.
And I think I thought at the time I would just saunter out of town and see the burrows and dig some up. But when I got there, I realized that it was like a needle in a haystack, and I wasn't, going to be able to find these things.
Hmm.
And I happened to go into the one local shop in this sort of one-horse town, and there on the shelf behind the counter was a glass jar with formalin or something in it, and one of these cockroaches preserved in it.
Yes.
I said, how comes you have that? And they said, oh, well, haven't you heard of Bill Brotherton? He was the first person to study these cockroaches in the wild, and he's the local naturalist. And in fact, he had hoped to put the town on the map, the Mount Garnet, the town, by
Hmm.
having silver-plated souvenir teaspoons with one of these
Oh,
cockroaches on the
oh,
handle.
there's one.
So look,
Oh, beautiful. Very
and
detailed even.
yeah, I think I was the only person ever to buy one. Actually, I bought two.
Who wants a cockroach teaspoon,
Exactly.
right?
But this is what the cockroaches actually look like. So this is one I collected earlier.
Oh wow, that is huge.
Yeah.
That is
So
gigantic.
you can see
Yeah, it's a
its head,
huge.
typical cockroach. It's got its head is below a shield called the pronotum.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know if you can see the forelegs there, like
Yes,
bull
like
legs.
shovels.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is a burrowing species.
Yes.
And well, as I mentioned earlier, but I didn't know how to find it. So I went to Bill Brotherton's house, and he came out, and he was a really charming old guy with it looked like something out of a Disney movie, with a long white beard and an old dog and an old pickup truck and a little personal museum of pickled snakes and things
Hmm.
in alcohol. And he said, yeah, I'll take you outside and show you. We'll go and collect some. So we went out with some spades
Uh-huh.
to out of town into the sparse eucalypt woodland. And basically, it was the dry season. And he showed me how to find these little ridges of sand
Hmm.
on the forest floor, which were the sealed up burrows of the cockroaches. They seal them up in the dry season.
Oh, of
So
course.
there would have been absolutely no way that I would have ever found them myself. But
No.
once you know what to look for, you can find the burrows and then dig down. And they live in this 1 meter long spiral burrow.
Okay. A spiral, just like scorpions do as well there. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
And usually just one adult female lives in a burrow together with her young. So they're also one of these advanced groups of cockroaches that incubates the eggs internally.
Mm.
And the young live with the mother for about 6 months, um, until they're half grown. And
Wow.
the mother goes to the surface at night and drags down dead eucalypt leaves and twigs and puts those into sort of chambers and lets the humidity and the solid sand soil that they're in kind of moisten them, and maybe fungi
Huh.
start to attack them. And during heavy rains, sometimes all the cockroaches are flooded out of their burrows and they come to the surface and go on the roads. And there's been records of motorists stopping and taking some of them and going to the local museum saying, "I found this, you know, little tortoise." They obviously didn't notice that it had 6 legs.
They're that big. Yeah.
As you can see, that they're very kind of shiny, like a
They are,
like
yeah,
tortoise.
big brown dome carapace. You would think maybe, well, if you didn't know anything about biology,
Yeah.
it's a tortoise.
But anyway, yeah, I was able to find them, and yeah, it was a really amazing experience, but really good luck that I happened to meet this guy, and he was the first person ever to study their, biology.
Wow.
Now they're quite widely kept in captivity, but they're very expensive, like 70 UK pounds, one for one.
Well, if
Um,
it takes that long for the young to grow up, and it's a big species, so I can imagine, yeah.
yeah, well, it's one of the longest lived insects. They can live for 7 years.
Really? Huh.
Yep. And so I guess, you get value for money if you cost it per year.
Yeah. Well, then that makes them cheaper than a hamster. That's But it's
I,
interesting what you said about the rotting of the detritus that they do, because it sounds a little bit like what leafcutter ants do, of course.
yeah, but they actually chew up the leaves and,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
cultivate a fungus in the leaves. But yeah, but it's sort of
Yeah.
along the
In
same lines, definitely.
Interesting. Yes.
Yeah, they're close relatives in their subfamily. Live in rotting logs. They're not related to the ones I just mentioned, the Cryptocercis. They're totally different group of cockroaches, but they've evolved to feed on wood as well.
Hmm.
And they live in family groups in rotting logs all around, mainly Southeast Asia.
Right.
Um, but then some in arid Australia have then developed this lifestyle of making burrows and coming up to get the leaves and stuff, because there's
That
not
is.
nice, moist, rotting logs lying around.
No, so they make do with what they have, and they make their own rotting logs, kind of.
Yeah,
Huh.
yeah.
Fascinating. I had never heard of that one. Never heard that one. Huh.
One other cockroach story.
Yes,
I was
please.
lucky enough to see come across the biggest winged cockroach in the world. So
Ooh,
this is Megaloblatta blabberoides. You can see from my finger that it is
that
not
is a
false perspective. And they can have a wingspan up to 18 centimeters across.
wow.
So, uh,
Beautiful. Four wings. Yeah.
and anyway, I was in Ecuador doing my PhD fieldwork, and I went to a reserve called Los Cedros up in the Andes. It was sort of mid-montane cloud forest, and there was a very, very basic accommodation um, with an outside long drop toilet, as call them, sort of a pit toilet.
Hmm.
And I was there one morning, I was sitting on the toilet, and suddenly one of these cockroaches appeared on the wall beside me. So I thought, bloody hell, this is a chance of a lifetime. So I grabbed it in one hand, and they're totally harmless. Like
Sure.
all, there's no cockroaches that can bite humans. There's one very aggressive cockroach that I found in Madagascar that can draw blood
Mm.
because it's got very long needle sharp spines on the legs, and it's a very, very powerful cockroach. And if you try and hold it, it will just jab you with these spines. And none of them can bite. Some of them can squirt nasty things, but this one doesn't. I don't
No,
know
I'm
how.
sure, but I'm sure a lot of people will flee if an 18-centimeter wingspan cockroaches comes flying in. I mean,
Yeah, I was attracted.
yeah, I know.
But anyway, I was sitting there with a cockroach in my hand, and then another one appeared. So I
Oh,
had to grab that. And then I thought, oh no, what am I going to do now? Because I haven't finished my toilet sort of. So I think I managed to get them into one hand, one on top of the other, and
right.
then do my business and then quickly go inside and put them in bags or whatever. So the one you've just seen is one of the two that I actually collected.
Really?
I never
Okay.
saw another one. And no one's managed to keep the species in captivity. People
Mm,
desperately want to,
mm.
but they just die. They
Oh,
might have a very specialized diet. Some cockroaches have very specialized food, so this species might feed on only on fungi or something. Um,
or something in that toilet. We don't know.
exactly.
It was attracted to something. I'm sure you were the only visitor ever to be enthusiastic about those cockroaches there, George.
Yeah, I didn't mention why I became interested in cockroaches. It was because, as I said, I got really interested in butterflies
Yeah.
in Zimbabwe,
Hmm.
and Zimbabwe had about 600 species of butterfly. I then went to North America, where there was only about 200, and that was a downer. And then I came to Britain, that has just over 50 species,
Yeah.
and there's about 500 books being written on these 50 species over time. You could have a whole library of British butterfly books, just recycling the same information. Um, so luckily, I met a guy who was interested in tropical cockroaches, and he got me interested. And
Hmm.
so I started keeping things like giant hissing cockroaches from Madagascar
Yes,
in
I've had them too.
captivity.
Yes, lovely. Yeah.
The first one I got was from a pet shop, and they were very rare in the country at the time. And it escaped, and I didn't find it till a year or so later when we moved house, and it was in my parents' record collection, and the records had fallen onto it, and it was like paper thin, totally flattened. But
I'm sure.
I went on years later to do 2 long expeditions to Madagascar to study and collect these cockroaches, and I found
Hmm.
quite a few new species, including the world's most aggressive cockroach that I mentioned.
Right, the one with the spines you just mentioned. Yes.
Yeah, which is a new genus, but I haven't
Okay.
got around to publishing it yet because, uh, well, that's a long story. But basically, when I was at the Natural History Museum, I did my PhD there, then got postdoc working on insect-plant relationships, mainly butterfly relationships.
Hmm.
Then my supervisor, who was the butterfly expert, retired, and I thought his job was going to be advertised because he was the one and only butterfly
Sure.
researcher at the museum. But the museum never advertised the job. They decided they didn't need a butterfly person, even though, being a butterfly researcher would attract much more money and all the rest than probably working on any other group of insects. So
Certainly the public
museums,
likes them better than cockroaches. Yeah.
exactly. And it's the same thing the museum's done with birds. There's no professional ornithologist on the
Really?
staff.
Huh.
So it's just curators.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the tendency of museums now. Yeah.
So anyway, a job as curator of orthopteroid insects, so cockroaches, stick insects, grasshoppers, crickets, earwigs, etc., came up. And because of my interest in cockroaches, I applied, and I'm the only person in the country, apart from my friend who now works at the Oxford Museum. Um, so I got the job, and that's what I did for, I don't know how long it was, 7 or so years.
Hmm.
And yeah, it was during that time that I um, studied the termite cockroach relationships and stuff like that.
Right, right. I mean, I was so lucky when I met you in Sulawesi because I just come across this tiny little animal that I photographed, and you were able to tell me it was a dwarf mole cricket.
Yes,
Yeah,
that
I'd
was the
never
first
seen
one I've
something like
ever
that
seen
before.
alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you're incredibly good at taking amazing pictures with the Olympus TG5
Yeah, still
camera.
have it.
I've tried taking macro photographs with it and just not been successful at all.
Well, I now know what it is, George. apparently they're not all the same because I bought another one and I cannot take as good pictures with that one as I
Oh,
can with the old one.
oh,
So apparently they're
interesting.
just not all good. No, but can you, I mean, just the fact that you run into the curator of orthopterans when you have a question like that in the field, it's fantastic luck for me.
Yeah. So anyway, I ended up leaving the museum because I had got interested in Alfred Russel Wallace and
Mm,
become.
yes.
And the museum was very, very happy that I was working on Wallace because he's obviously one of the top naturalists of all time. And I helped organize the worldwide celebrations for the um, 100, what was it, the 100th anniversary of his death in, he died in 1913, so this was 2023.
Mm-hmm.
No, 2013, sorry. And the museum did all kinds of things, an exhibition. I raised money for a life-size or larger than life-size bronze statue of Wallace, etc. And the museum was very happy that I spent part of my time working on Wallace, especially when I then decided to start the Wallace Correspondence Project, because
Yes.
going back a step, due to all my work on Wallace and commemorating him, I got to know the Wallace family. So
Mm-hmm.
his two grandsons were still alive.
Right.
And I got to know one in particular, Dick Wallace, and he showed me when I went to his house uh, part of Wallace's insect collection, plus a library of all of the books Wallace had written and the editions and foreign language editions, all annotated by Wallace.
Wow.
And then there were something like 6,000 other documents, including notebooks and all kinds of things. So
Mm-hmm.
to cut a long story short, I arranged for the museum to buy the whole collection, and it came to the museum, was catalogued, and then it went into the rare books room, which is very difficult to access. You, as a
Ah, yeah.
researcher, you can't just go to the rare books room and go through the collection. You have to know what's in the collection, then ask for one thing after the other. I want to see so and so letter,
Right.
etc. So I decided to set up a project to digitize the collection. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to digitize 6,000 documents, I might as well try and digitize every letter in all the archives in the world.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
so I managed to get a big grant from a foundation in America, about £500,000, and employed an archivist and people, and I supervise it for one day a week,
Right.
and designed the database system and everything. And we basically had huge numbers of volunteers as well as the archivist. Um, After all the letters were scanned, uh, basically transcribing all the letters, and they're now all available on a system called Epsilon, which is online through.
Yes, I will put a link in the description of this video and this podcast.
Thanks.
I've accessed it. It's very interesting to see his own letters and his own writing. Yeah, it's
Absolutely.
fantastic.
It's a treasure trove for people interested in the history of science. And
Yes.
no one person has read more than about 10 or 20% of the letters so far. And I know that there's enough material for several PhDs in there,
Mm,
like a PhD on Wallace's thoughts about Lamarckian evolution,
hmm.
for instance. Because, I
Yeah.
mean, most people don't realize these days that uh, Darwin's theory of adaptive evolution was a combination of natural selection and Lamarckism, which he called use and disuse inheritance. And
Yes.
he devoted an entire chapter of origin to use and disuse inheritance. Whereas Wallace and Darwin jointly published the theory of natural selection in 1858, 15 months before Origin came out.
Yeah.
And Wallace, in his essay, so I won't explain the whole story, but Wallace sent Darwin an essay about natural selection, which was, ready for publication. And he actually attacks Lamarck in the essay and totally refutes Lamarckian selection. So Wallace was actually the first modern evolutionist, the first neo-Darwinian, because he rejected Lamarckism in favor of
Yes.
pure natural selection, whereas Darwin never rejected Lamarckian view.
Hmm.
So there's lots of letters and things related to this, and that could be, a
Yeah, but
possible.
digging that out of all those thousands of letters, that would be a lot of work. But now
Oh,
that you've digitized it,
it's easy to do now. You just
yeah,
look for keywords
yeah,
in Epsilon system.
yeah.
Anyway, where was I going with this? Oh, yes. So I started this big project to do all the letters. And then I got a new boss. So my former boss was happy for me to work a day or two a week on Wallace. But my new boss, she thought, well, he's supposed to be a curator of insects. So he has to spend all his time on that.
Ah,
And uh, then we were running out of money for the first grant. And another organization contacted me and said, how would you like to apply for more funding through us? And it sounded like a dead certainty that if I applied, I
mm-hmm.
would get the money. So I knew that she wouldn't agree to it. So I went to the head of department and said to him, I got this problem. I could get, a huge amount of money to continue the project, but my boss isn't going to like it. And he said, oh yeah, go ahead, apply for the money and I'll sort it all out. So I got the grant, and then
Yeah.
she got to hear of it, and was furious.
Ah,
And unfortunately, at the Natural History Museum in London, it's exceptionally bureaucratic. It's like Rome became before the fall of the Roman Empire, with tons and tons of layers of bureaucracy from one manager to the other. So within the entomology department, there was my boss, and her boss was the head of entomology collections. Then she had a boss above her that was the head of all the life science collections, and then there was the head of department. So my boss influenced the boss above her to take sides and to stop me from doing the work on Wallace, and overrode the head of department.
mm.
And so I was told, sorry, you have to give back, £500,000, and
Wow.
stop work. So I had no, I just, yeah, I decided to resign.
I
And then,
imagine, yeah.
yeah, and then the museum tried to grab the project by writing to the funders, the new funders, saying, George has left the museum. We can take on the grant. So,
Right.
so they were going to get the library to manage
Yeah,
the project. But the funders actually told me that this had happened. So,
good.
and they were furious as well with
Mm-hmm.
the museum. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I then had to find a place an organization to host the grant, because it has to be managed through a charity. And
Right.
I tried various organizations, no luck. Then I happened to remember Randall Keynes, who's Charles Darwin's great grandson, and
Mm-hmm.
he was head of the Charles Darwin Trust. And I had met him years ago. I contacted him. He was very enthusiastic. He said, yes, the Charles Darwin Trust will manage the money. And so that's what happened. So I set up the
Okay.
project, I got an office, I hired two kind of full-time staff and quite a few temporary staff, and we continued, yeah, the project, and um, it's now in a pretty advanced state. But then we ran out of money, and I haven't managed to get a grant since then. So I'm now funding the project partly by being the naturalist guide and speaker on Wallace and natural history on
Mm-hmm.
board uh, sort of bouquet cruise ship in Indonesia.
Yes.
So being run by a company called Sea Trek Sailing Adventures,
Yes.
and it's a brilliant ship with only 22 cabins, and there's as many staff as there are guests, and it's got sails that it can use at times. And we go to really remote parts of Indonesia where literally no other Western tourists ever go there, because you can only get there by ship, and they're all off the tourist routes.
Right.
So they're amazed to see us. And I remember just on the last trip, we stopped in a port on an island, and all these little kids came over to have a real close look. They'd never seen living white people before, even though they were, 6 and 7 years old.
Wow.
They were really fascinated.
That's really off the beaten track.
Yeah.
Ah,
So that's really enjoyable. I do 4 trips a year, spend uh, 2 months of the year out in Indonesia, and
lovely. Yeah.
In Search of Wallace and His Living Treasures trip, where we see birds of paradise displaying, and uh, golden birdwing butterfly, one of the biggest butterflies in the world that Wallace discovered in the Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and
Yeah. And
um,
that's the thing. I mean, you really need a ship's naturalist on such a trip because you can go to the remotest place in the world, but you will not know what is unique and what is special about these places unless somebody very knowledgeable can tell you about it, right? And also, I mean, I've seen you pictures of you sitting in the places where Wallace spent some time. It must be very special for you to visit the places where, well,
oh,
our hero
absolutely,
essentially spent a lot of time.
yeah. Well, on the next trip, I'm going out to Indonesia in September, and on the 5th of October, I arranged through Sea-Trek to have a big black granite plaque
Mm.
made commemorating Wallace's independent discovery of natural selection in the village of Dodinga on
Hmm.
the island of Halmahera. That's where he was when he had his malarial epiphany and discovered natural selection after thinking about the mechanism for 10 years. And I was the only, I heard of one other tourist, one other Westerner who went to that um, village before I did.
Okay.
Um, the villagers didn't know about the history,
Huh.
and the rest of the world didn't because they assumed that Wallace discovered the theory on Ternate Island, which is nearby. But that's where he actually posted his essay to Darwin
Right.
from. But anyway, so we're having this. We're going to unveil this plaque, and Bill Wallace, Wallace's great grandson, is going from Canada, is going to be on the trip, and
All
he's going
right.
to unveil it, and it will be a plaque commemorating Wallace's, you know, earth-shattering discovery while there.
It, yeah, it was,
So
and it's amazing that in such a short time well, not a short time, of course, he's been thinking about it for many years, but in a one epiphany, he managed to write the whole thing down in one short essay, which took Darwin a whole book pretty much. Yeah.
yeah, but if you look at the original Darwin Wallace paper on natural selection of 1858, I did so a few months ago because people always say Darwin and Wallace's theories were similar, but actually they're not. They're identical. If you
Mm.
look at the definition of natural selection and all the steps that have to occur for the process to work, and then look at Darwin's writings that were published alongside Wallace's, every single step of the process is mentioned by both men. They
Ah,
came up with it independently, and some of the steps, you know, could easily have been missed out, but their theories of natural selection were absolutely identical. It's quite remarkable. But Wallace had been thinking about it for 10 years,
hmm.
whereas Darwin actually came up with it pretty rapidly. He
Oh,
was actually a Christian and uh,
hmm.
well, certainly not an evolutionist when he was in the Galapagos, but shortly after getting back to England, he had begun to have doubts about the fixity of species. And
Right.
within a fairly short space of time, he had discovered natural selection. But it had taken Wallace 10 years of careful thought and lots of previous writings that were getting closer and closer to the mechanism.
And I think it's wonderful that you are doing all these efforts to commemorate him and to remind the world that there was not one discoverer of the theory of evolution, but there are two. And this
Exactly.
one's really important and sometimes forgotten or overlooked. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important even for, to combat creationists because they all say, oh, Darwin's theory,
Yeah.
that's wrong. But actually, two people came up with the same idea independently. So, how
Mm.
comes, it's makes it much less likely that the initial theory is going to be wrong if two people come up with it independently.
Exactly. And thousands of people have confirmed it since.
Exactly.
It's not unimportant.
No,
And
it's now
great to
a
hear that you're
law.
still doing the Sea Trek tours there. I mean, it must be a wonderful trip to go with you. I mean, I really enjoyed my time with you when we were in Indonesia. You know so much about all these subjects, so that's definitely a treat for anybody who goes on board.
No, that's very kind. Thank you.
I know.
Well, you
I
must
hope a
come
lot of people
aboard
get the
sometime.
opportunity. Hmm?
Yeah, if you have a sudden cash windfall, please come on board.
I
Unfortunately,
will.
their trips are a bit expensive. I would
Mhm.
never be able to afford them.
Yes, because so few people can come on the ship, of course. Yes. But it's I'm sure that's definitely a unique experience to go with you and see all these super rare places. And I'm sure you come back with a lot more stories to tell us next time, George, I hope.
Yeah, I didn't tell you all the stories that I had I was going to, but I think we've basically run out of time, haven't we?
Well, then I'll have to ask you back sometime soon.
Okay.
I'd love to hear some more. If people want to know more about you or book a tour or anything, where should we go for any of your projects? Online,
Um,
maybe?
yeah, online. The best place is the Wallace Memorial Fund. If you just type Wallace Memorial Fund, you'll find my webpage, which um, is not working very well at the moment for some reason. The server it's on is malfunctioning, but it
Hmm,
still works. And it's got details of my Sea Trek trips, or alternatively, just type in Sea Trek, one word, um, Beccaloni. Um,
yes.
or Wallace, and you'll find my trips. And then there's the Wallace Correspondence Project page, which is on the same server that's malfunctioning. So, but it is. Hopefully, that will be sorted out soon. And then I'm on LinkedIn, and I bet my email is very easy to find because amazingly enough, I'm the only George Beccaloni in the world. So if
Oh,
you type in George Beccaloni email, you'll probably find it.
all right. All right. I'll put all those links in with the description of this podcast. And with that, George, thank you very much for your fantastic stories. We learned a lot about cockroaches and Wallace and everything else. And I'm really looking forward to having you on again sometime soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Thanks very much.